So we have heard the good news about what we are doing locally in funding students to advance their education. But national is also doing their part. We had in 2025 256 recipients for fellowship and grants. 18 of them were from California, and we are so happy. We have one of them tonight. She's going to do her presentation to us about her doctoral studies. She's Amy Reid. Amy Reid is a PhD candidate in film and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She holds a BFA from the Cooper Union and MFA from UC San Diego. Amy is finishing her dissertation, Feminist Relationality in the Americas, Women's Practice in Filmmaking and Quilting. Amy's work questions how labor is constructed in the filmmaker form through feature-length films, video installation, and text. Tonight, Amy is going to share with us some of her wonderful work. Please welcome Amy.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. Thank you, everyone here. And of course, the AAUW, yeah, it's really lovely to hear the local work your chapter is doing for women and girls. And I feel deeply honored that I was a recipient of one of the dissertation fellowships for this year. Amazing that there was 18 of the 25 that came from California. So that just goes to show that California is the best state. And yeah, so I'll talk to you tonight about my dissertation work, which is just down the way at UC Santa Cruz. I am in my 7th year, and I will be finishing my dissertation hopefully next year after I give birth to my first kid. So we'll see. But yes, it's a now I'm even more motivated to finish because of my due date in October. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my dissertation as a whole, and then I'm going to share a little bit of film excerpt from one of the chapters, which is a film, as you'll kind of learn more about. So as Lucinda said, my dissertation title is a little bit of a mouthful, but it's called Feminist Relationality in the Americas, Women's Practices in Filmmaking and Quilting. And so I'm focusing on both looking at feminist film histories, predominantly from the 1970s, the long 1970s, and I can kind of explain what I mean by long in a second. And then I'm also kind of employing the methods that feminist filmmakers used in the 70s to kind of inform how I make films myself. I've been making films, as Lucinda said. I've got a BFA at the Cooper Union in New York. That was an interdisciplinary program, but then I did my MFA at UC San Diego. And I made a feature-length film where I rode with female long-haul truckers. The film is called Long Haulers, so if you're curious to watch that, that's on Canopy. I'm pretty sure, most public library accounts have Canopy access, so if you're curious to see what women your age and even older who are long-haul truckers, I rode with them. So already, like a lot of my work has been, even before my dissertation, around looking, as Lucinda said in my intro, about women's work and the labor that women do, both creatively and then also, of course, for money. So I also will note right here is an image from a program series called Gravitational Lensing, and that's a little bit of an offshoot of my dissertation work. Certainly the histories I'm looking at of the 70s inform this. It's a film series that I co-run at a micro cinema spot in Oakland. So I used to live in Bonnie Doon, and then I got a little overwhelmed by the woods after the fire, so I moved up to Oakland, and I've been there since for about 5 years now. So I co-run this program series at a theater space, and we're looking at feminist films from the feminist space-time continuum. So not just the 70s in this case for that series, we're looking at early films, and then we did an open call where filmmakers submitted films that sort of spoke to feminist politics in whatever way that really we left it very open-ended in terms of like the sort of subject matter that you could apply for. But that's an ongoing series, and we're actually having a program coming up on Saturday night. If any of you guys want to make a field trip to Oakland, we're doing a program on women, war, and politics, so how women have reacted to the theme of politics and of war from a feminist standpoint. So why I'm focusing on the 70s in my dissertation work is kind of because, maybe you guys can also reflect on this as maybe, growing up in the 70s, if you did, is the 70s was a huge period in the women's movement, amongst other political movements that were going on, right? The Vietnam War, gay liberation, the women's rights movements, Roe v. Wade, all of those things were happening. And as those were happening, there was a lot of creative work that women were doing in the terrain of filmmaking. So that was, things like the Women in Film Journal here, which started in the 70s. This distribution company I'll talk about in a second called Serious Business Company that started actually originally in San Francisco, but then moved to Oakland. And then just like more generally, you had things like the Women's Survival Catalog coming out in the early 70s. So there's a lot of material, both of course films, but also support networks that were starting to form in the 70s and even a little bit before then. So when I say the long 70s, it's one of those maybe, I don't know what academics like to make things sound a little poetic, but what I mean by that is like looking at the late 1960s into the early 1980s. I'm also interested in looking at that period from a sort of political standpoint in terms of thinking about different political movements, like again, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, women's movement, and then also sort of the rise of neoliberalism and Reaganism that kind of really shifted how these creative practices continued to kind of thrive or not as it moved into the 80s. So, and like kind of as an overview, the dissertation is both, as I was saying, a film, which I'll show you a little bit of tonight, a sort of very, I think, rough cut. It's a feature-length experimental documentary about women in quilting in US history called Grandmother's Garden. And then I'm doing 3 written chapters that are kind of looking at different like facets, I would say, of feminist filmmaking. I am thinking also sort of generatively of this like metaphor for my work as a dissertation as a quilt. And in that I mean like I'm really employing a lot of oral history in my work because frankly a lot of the things that I'm looking at, even from the 70s, there's not a lot written about, these women who were filmmakers then or the histories that took place. And luckily, a good amount of those people are still alive. Also, some of the people I've been studying and looking at are no longer alive, but their children are, their friends are, spouses might be. But the sort of premise and sort of the foundation, instead of looking at old texts written by white men, I'm like really going to the primary sources of these histories, and that's the lived experiences of those women. Of course, too, like oral history is a huge component of Grandmother's Garden, the film, to interview these quilters. Also, in this project is intergenerational exchange. So, I'm 39. A lot of the people who I'm interviewing and meeting for my projects, both the film and of course the written dissertation work, are older than me. So it's kind of about this exchange of, what is relevant about the histories from the 1970s and then of course earlier histories in quilting to sort of the present moment now. How am I connecting as a feminist? I identify, I think, as a feminist filmmaker. how does my sort of political perspective and practice as a feminist filmmaker connect to the feminist filmmakers of the 70s, and really thinking about this like past and present and what's sort of continuing or changed or different. And then also within this is this sort of like self-reflexivity of like, who am I in relation to the material that I'm studying? So here's just a few pictures of some of the quilters, some of the filmmakers I've been meeting to kind of emphasize this idea of oral history and also really I think like building, the title of my dissertation is Feminist Relationality, building relationships with people, building connections with people. I think for me, even before my dissertation work, it's really important to create a sense of community with other women around things that we care about. And also, of course, I think to really kind of highlight the undervalued work that women have been doing and continue to do, whether that's trucking or quilting or filmmaking. So it's really important for me to be with these people in an authentic way. So I'll talk a little bit, I don't know where we're on in time, but, because I didn't bring up a...
You're good.
Okay. So maybe let me know when I've got like 5 more minutes.
Sure. You want to leave a little period for Q&A?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to show more rather than tell about this project, but as I was saying, even though my film is about quilting and not about 1970s feminist film histories, I think a lot of the same methods of how I'm using different filmic strategies or how I'm building relationships with people or how I'm kind of like thinking through how I'm making this project is informed by the 1970s and what women were doing during that time. And so with Grandmother's Garden, as I was saying, it's a film about women, history, US history, and quilting. And here I'm really thinking about both, of course, the past histories of the US and then also the present. And I'm thinking very tangibly about the materiality of quilts, cotton fabric, batting, thread, and how that connects to these histories that are really, I think, in my opinion, foundational to the US. So here's a really great example, in my opinion. Cotton was a huge economy in the US in the 19th century, and industrialism in the New England area, and then after the 50s moved down to the South, but there are a huge amount of mills in New England. And so that's one aspect of my film, is looking at New England amongst some other regions. Right here on the left here, or right, if I'm looking forward, is a quilt made by a textile worker from the 1920s. She was a Portuguese immigrant who immigrated to New England and was working in the mills. Specifically, I believe she worked in the Boot Cotton Mill, which was one of the first that started in Lowell, Massachusetts. And she would use scraps from the mill that she was working at to make quilts. This is at the New England Quilt Museum. If any of you guys go to Lowell, I really recommend it. It's a wonderful museum. It has a lot of amazing stuff that's not just New England quilts. And here's an image of an unknown textile worker. Because again, there's a lot of women who began working in the mills, mostly because they were cheaper labor than men. And also because the Lowell girls was a thing even before the 1920s. They were farm girls coming into the city, and they would leave, right? Because they would get married or, soon there. So they were seen as expendable labor that was, valuable to these mill owners who can make more of a profit using their work before immigrants came in. And then, it's a big plus if it was a woman who was an immigrant. So the film, I began in 2020, sort of at the beginning of my dissertation studies. I formally began my PhD in the fall of 2019, but I kind of began filming more in earnest in 2020 after some of the craziness of the pandemic lessened. And the areas that I'm looking at are in Oregon and Montana, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maine. It's a lot of places. I've driven almost all of them, except for New England. I usually fly out to those. And mostly because I'm going to semi-rural places or places that are a little bit more inaccessible. And I've both been kind of focusing on archival collections and museum spaces that hold quilts from the early 19th century, but I'm also meeting with active quilters within these regions, and again, thinking about the sort of intergenerational connections that are threaded throughout my dissertation work. I'm really kind of interested to see, how, if we can look at a quilt from the past and in order to sort of understand these more complicated histories of the US, what can we look at the sort of contemporary practices of quilters today in order to understand where we're at in the US right now? It's a little harder to kind of grasp at that, in my opinion, and hopefully I'll come to some conclusion when the film is finished. But in that, I've been going to quilt guilds, meeting with individual quilters one-on-one, and also going to sort of more informal quilt guilds that are, like church groups, I would say. And then also I've been filming in a lot of institution spaces, museums, college collections, state archives, to access these quilts and ephemera that connect to these histories. I'm just gonna kind of quickly give you an overview of the 3 written chapters before I show you an example from Grandmother's Garden. The first, the kind of 3 notes that I think are most important for me in terms of thinking about feminist film history is thinking about distribution, so how films circulated and moved around and how they were accessed. I'm also thinking about how films were made, how did these women actually do what they did? And then lastly, how did films kind of get screened and what were the conversations that were happening and what was sort of the culture of women coming together in the 70s, because that was a huge thing, and a big reason why films were being made is to kind of show them in these consciousness raising groups in order to have conversations around topics like rape or abortion or things that, frankly were not being spoken about prior to the 1970s as much as they were in the 70s. So some of the histories I'm looking at are very regional and close. I know this gift might be kind of exhausting after a while, but this is a woman named Freuda. She just went by Freuda. And she was a filmmaker who started at SF State, actually. She dropped out of school and actually started to distribute films because her husband at the time was an experimental filmmaker in San Francisco. And she was actually a really good business person and pretty savvy in distributing his films. They divorced, and she leveraged her skill as a business person, saw sort of the popularity within feminist films and also experimental films at the time, and decided to create her own business called Serious Business, which she was very, she's passed away in 2009, but from what I've learned about her, she was a very humorous person, even though she was a very extremely business savvy person. So that chapter is really looking at her archives and thinking about her company and how it was very different in some ways from other feminist film distributors of the period. And luckily, UC Berkeley holds all of her archives, so I've been able to go there a lot and have about a 65-page chapter on her. And she was really cool in that she was distributing both I think a lot of my stuff as a filmmaker, as you'll see probably from the example, I'm both making documentary projects that are very much about providing information and sort of educational films, but I'm also an artist and making experimental films. And so she really merged this combination that I think is interesting, and it was unlike other distributors, where she was merging these two different kind of genres of filmmaking. So she would have a film by a San Francisco women's collective that made a film about getting self-cervical exams, breast exams, and I think another pelvic exam that was called Self-Health, that was distributed. It was made in 1974. So again, women's groups would rent this film, they'd watch it, they'd learn, oh, like this is how I can give myself a cervical exam. But then she also had really beautiful animations and experimental films by women artists in conjunction with these more educational films. The other chapter that I'm working on right now is on an experimental filmmaker named Joanne Elam, who was a postal worker. She was based out of Chicago, and she was really had very explicit feminist film projects that she did, such as this chocolate cake film, which it's a film where she's literally making a chocolate cake, and at the end of the film, she steps on it. The sort of story goes that she made a chocolate cake for a film screening, and all these men didn't really appreciate her or really noticed her, and so she made this film sort of as a like screw you to like not being valued. She also made a very powerful film, in my opinion, called Reid, which she worked with rape survivors and was kind of critiquing rape culture as it was sort of understood in the 70s. You know, not just the physical act of rape, but the sort of social conception of rape and how power is asserted over women or people who are more vulnerable. So the chapter that I'm looking at for this is really thinking about like how is a feminist filmmaker making work and thinking about work, both from a sort of logistical standpoint of like how did she make her films, but also like how was she thinking about creating imagery, and how she was thinking about merging her sort of political opinions alongside with like the visuals that she was using in her films. And then lastly, thinking about screening cultures, and to sort of tie in Latin America, which was a thread that didn't fully get taken up in my dissertation in full, but is in this project, is thinking about the first UN's International Year of the Woman that took place in 1974, I believe. And the film that was kind of not made for the UN, but showed and premiered at the UN, which was called the Doubleday. You see a poster here by the Women's Film Project, which was a collective of women, some of which were coming from Brazil and Argentina, some of which were US citizens. And it was a film that was looking at the reproductive and productive labor that women in Latin America performed. So she filmed with, this group filmed with women in Bolivia, in Argentina, and one other country that I'm blanking on. And it was shown at, what's that?
Peru.
Oh, wonderful.
Right?
I don't think it was Peru, it's Bolivia, but sorry.
Peru is right next to Bolivia.
I know, you're totally right.
It's a big country.
She might have filmed in Mexico, to be honest, because she was thinking about sort of not just South America, but like Latin America in general. And this film got shown at the first International Year of the Women, and here I'm thinking about how films were used sort of on this like global feminist platform or space, and the sort of how films created conversations, what was the end point of making films, right, is to show them and to have conversations or to have sort of public awareness. And so this is, to be honest, this is the chapter that I've not really written yet, so it's the least formed in my brain. but it will sort of, I think it's important to kind of address this third part of the triad of what I see as important in feminist filmmaking is screenings. And so some questions I'm asking in my dissertation to sort of end here before I show you guys some material if there's time is what can be learned from these feminist film practices of the long 70s? You know, what are the potentials that were really, I think for me personally exciting and why I kind of gravitated towards this material, but also its limitations in terms of the, I think like limited perspective sometimes of second wave feminism and addressing ideas around gender or class or race. You know, what other questions I'm asking are what, or the US and Latin America relationships that existed in the 70s. So like sort of the political relationships of that period in the 70s. What were and also what are the relationships now that emerge in feminist film practices and quilt practices in terms of, you know, tonight at dinner we were talking about quilting bees or, you know, collectives. You know, I think AAUW is a really great example of this that's sort of dwindling now, but like how do women congregate together and how do we like be in community with each other? And for me, I think both quilting and filmmaking really provided spaces for women to be with each other in a way that's becoming harder to access, in my opinion, at least for my generation. And then lastly, how do the forms of these relationships and the dynamics that they live out shape and form, you know, how a film is made, what it looks like, what sort of genre it takes, et cetera, et cetera. So that's it in a sort of nutshell. There's certainly more details to share about my work, and I'd be happy to answer those during the Q&A, or if you guys want to email me with any sort of thoughts or questions, you're more than welcome to. I don't know where we're at on time. But
We're good, if you want to show part of your.
How much time?
You've got about 20 minutes.
Okay, well that's great, but that includes Q&A time, right?
Yes.
So, but now, your email is not Amy with a Y, it's A-M-E?
It's AMC.
C.
Catherine is my middle name, so, you know, this is just like how the university generates their email addresses for people, I don't know. It's AMC Reid at ucsc.edu, yeah. Well, you know, with that, I think I'll show just a few minutes of the beginning of this work in progress. It's 29 minutes, so we're not going to show it all, or I'm not going to show it all, but we'll watch a little bit and then I'll turn it off after.
5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah. All right.
Can we dim the lights?
Could you say your email was amyreid.what?
AMC
AMC.
REID